January 17th, 1945. Alsace. Dawn. The frost clung to the barrels of the M1 Garands like silent prayers. In the pale light before sunrise, American infantrymen of the Third Army pressed forward through snow that swallowed their boots to the ankle. Each breath emerged as vapor, each step a muffled crunch in the frozen earth. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German machine guns waited. The men could not see them, but they knew. They always knew. This was not yet Berlin, not even close, but every meter gained here was a meter closer to the heart of the Reich. The soldiers did not speak of Berlin in those morning hours. They spoke of warmth, of coffee, of the next village, the next field, the next breath. But Berlin waited ahead like a dark star, pulling them forward through ice and blood. The path to Berlin had been drawn not in strategy rooms alone, but in the accumulated weight of 3 years of industrial thunder and ideological resolve. When the Wehrmacht had rolled across Europe in 1939 and 1940, it had done so with a doctrine forged in the fires of the Great War's lessons: swift maneuver, combined arms, the integration of air and armor into a single deadly instrument. Blitzkrieg was not merely a tactic, it was a philosophy. German commanders had watched their nation bleed in the trenches of Verdun and the Somme, and they had vowed never again to fight that kind of war. They would move, they would strike. They would win before the enemy could entrench. And for a time, it worked. Poland fell in weeks. France, the mighty republic that had bled Germany white a generation before, collapsed in 43 days. The swastika flew over Paris while the world held its breath. By the summer of 1940, German soldiers stood on the cliffs of Calais and stared across the Channel at an isolated Britain. The Wehrmacht seemed invincible, a machine of Teutonic efficiency and will. Its soldiers believed in their superiority, not merely in arms, but in spirit, in blood, in destiny. But war is not won by belief alone. It is won by steel and oil and wheat and the capacity to replace what is lost. The United States possessed these in quantities that defied comprehension. When America entered the war in December 1941, it brought with it not just men, but an industrial engine that would reshape the arithmetic of global conflict. In 1942, American factories produced 47,000 aircraft. In 1943, that number climbed to 86,000. By 1944, the United States was manufacturing more war material than all the Axis powers combined. Trucks rolled off assembly lines in Detroit every 60 seconds. Liberty ships, each one a floating warehouse of supply, slid into the ocean faster than German U-boats could sink them. The Wehrmacht had been designed for short, victorious wars. America was building for a long one. German soldiers in the East had already learned what this meant. On the vast steppe of Russia, they had encountered not just Soviet determination, but Soviet capacity, the ability to lose entire armies and raise new ones, to abandon whole cities and build new factories beyond the Urals. But the Americans brought something different. They brought abundance. When the first GIs landed in North Africa in November 1942, German and Italian prisoners stared in disbelief at the American supply columns. Trucks that seemed newer than any vehicle they had seen. Rations that included chocolate, cigarettes, canned fruit, luxuries the Wehrmacht had not tasted in years. One captured German officer, interrogated in Tunisia, remarked that the Americans fought as if they were on holiday. He did not mean it as a compliment, but there was truth buried in his contempt. The U.S. Army did not merely sustain its soldiers, it sustained them well. This abundance was not accidental. It was strategic. American commanders understood that morale was a weapon as tangible as artillery. A well-fed soldier fought harder, marched farther, endured longer. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was already beginning to fray at its logistical seams. By 1944, German rations had been cut multiple times. Ersatz coffee made from acorns, bread stretched with sawdust, meat that arrived sporadically, if at all. Horses, hundreds of thousands of them, still pulled the majority of German supply wagons, a fact that would have shocked those who believed in the myth of total mechanization. The panzer divisions might roar forward on diesel and gasoline, but the infantry followed on hooves and worn boot leather. The clash of these two systems, American plenty and German pride, would reach its crescendo not in a single battle, but in a grinding advance that consumed the final months of the war. After the breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944, Allied forces had raced across France with a speed that surprised even their own commanders. Paris was liberated in August. By September, American and British armies stood at the German frontier. But then the advance slowed. Supply lines stretched thin. Gasoline ran short. And the Wehrmacht, bloodied but unbroken, dug in along the Siegfried Line and prepared to defend the fatherland itself. The German soldiers who manned those fortifications in the autumn of 1944 were not the same men who had conquered Europe 4 years earlier. The Eastern Front had devoured the best divisions, the most experienced officers, the irreplaceable veterans. What remained in the West was a patchwork of understrength units, hastily trained replacements, aging reservists, and boys of the Hitler Youth pressed into service before they had finished growing. But they were defending their homeland now, and that knowledge hardened them. They expected the Americans to falter. They expected the industrial giant to reveal itself as a paper tiger, soft and undisciplined, reliant on machines because it lacked the will to fight with soul and steel. They were wrong. The American soldier of 1945 was not the green recruit who had stumbled through his first engagements in North Africa. He had learned his trade in Sicily, in Italy, on the beaches of Normandy, and in the hedgerows of Normandy's bocage country. He had learned to coordinate infantry and armor, to call in artillery and air support with lethal precision, to maneuver under fire, and adapt to the chaos of combat. The U.S. Army had become a professional force, tempered by experience and supported by a logistical network that seemed almost supernatural in its reach. Hot food arrived at the front lines. Mail from home came with astonishing regularity. Wounded men were evacuated by ambulance and treated in field hospitals equipped with penicillin and whole blood. Medical miracles that saved thousands who would have died in any previous war. And yet, the path to Berlin remained uncertain. In December 1944, Hitler launched his final gamble in the West, the Ardennes Offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. German armored spearheads smashed through thinly held American positions in the snow-choked forests of Belgium, seeking to split the Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. For a few desperate days, it seemed the German military might achieve one last miracle. But the miracle did not come. American units held key road junctions, most famously at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne refused to surrender despite being surrounded and outnumbered. The weather cleared. Allied aircraft filled the skies, and the German offensive, starved of fuel and ammunition, ground to a halt. The panzers that had driven so deep into American lines were abandoned when their tanks ran dry. By late January, the Bulge had been erased, and the Wehrmacht had expended its last reserves in a futile bid to reverse the inevitable. Now the Allies drove east. The Rhine, that ancient barrier and symbol of German sovereignty, was crossed in March 1945. American engineers threw pontoon bridges across the river while fighter-bombers roared overhead, suppressing German artillery. Entire armies poured into the heart of Germany. The plan, however, was not for the Americans to take Berlin. That prize, that symbol, had been allocated to the Soviet Union. Churchill had argued for a thrust toward the German capital, a political objective to prevent Stalin from claiming it alone. But General Eisenhower, the supreme commander, made a different calculation. Berlin lay deep in the agreed-upon Soviet zone of occupation. The Red Army was closer, bloodier, and more numerous. And the city itself, Eisenhower believed, held no strategic value worth the cost in American lives. Better to advance along a broad front, to encircle and destroy the remaining German armies, to end the war swiftly and thoroughly. And yet, American forces did drive toward Berlin, not as their primary objective, but as part of the relentless compression of German territory from all sides. Patton's Third Army and Hodges's First Army sliced through central Germany, overrunning cities that had never known war on their soil. Frankfurt, Leipzig, Weimar, where American soldiers would liberate the nightmare of Buchenwald and confront the true face of the regime they were destroying. The German military continued to resist, not because it had hope of victory, but because surrender meant the end of everything they had built, everything they had believed. Fanaticism replaced strategy. Boys with Panzerfausts crouched in rubble, waiting to ambush American tanks. Volkssturm units, old men and children, were ordered to hold positions with rifles from the previous century. American soldiers found the contrast jarring. They had expected to face the vaunted Wehrmacht, the professional force that had conquered a continent. Instead, they encountered desperation. German prisoners in the final weeks were often relieved to surrender, grateful for food and cigarettes and the promise of survival. One American lieutenant, writing home in April 1945, described capturing a German position and finding the soldiers inside subsisting on rotten potatoes and melted snow. They had not been resupplied in 2 weeks. Their uniforms were threadbare, their weapons rusted. They looked, he wrote, like ghosts of an army that no longer exists. But ghosts can still kill. The fighting remained brutal. Every town had to be cleared, every bridge contested, every river forded under fire. American casualties mounted, even as victory became certain. The soldiers understood the terrible mathematics. The closer they came to the end, the more obscene it seemed to die now, with peace so near. And yet they advanced, because that was the only way to bring the end. The Americans did not take Berlin in the way the Soviets did, with a frontal assault that cost hundreds of thousands of lives in street-to-street annihilation. But they contributed to its fall by making it inevitable. The Ruhr Pocket, encircled in April, trapped over 300,000 German soldiers and removed Germany's industrial heartland from the war. American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River on April 25th, cutting Germany in two. When Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th, Soviet shells were falling on the ruins above him, but it was the combined weight of East and West that had driven him there. Berlin fell to the Red Army on May 2nd. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. American soldiers who reached central Germany in those final days found a nation in collapse. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing the advancing Soviets. Cities burned from Allied bombing. The myth of Aryan supremacy lay shattered in the rubble. And in the midst of it all, American units distributed rations to starving civilians, set up field kitchens, imposed order on chaos. The same abundance that had sustained the advance now became a tool of occupation. German children who had been taught to hate the Americans stood in line for chocolate bars and marveled that the enemy could be so generous. There was a recurring image in those days, the American sea ration. Olive drab cans filled with beef stew, crackers, candy, cigarettes. To a German soldier who had eaten sawdust bread and watery soup, it was a symbol of everything his nation had lacked. Not just food, but the capacity to produce it endlessly, to deliver it across oceans and continents, to feed an army while simultaneously feeding a homeland that never went hungry. One captured Wehrmacht officer, sitting in a POW camp in May 1945, was given an American ration. He opened the can of peaches, sweet, bright, impossible, and stared at it for a long moment. Then he ate slowly, as if trying to understand through taste how his nation had lost. The clash had not been one of titans in the mythic sense. It had been a clash of systems, one built on conquest and plunder, reliant on speed and the fragility of its enemies. The other built on production and depth, capable of sustaining loss and returning stronger. The German military had been magnificent in its way, professional, brave, tactically brilliant. But brilliance without resources is a flame that burns bright and dies fast. America had brought not just soldiers, but the weight of a continent's worth of farms and factories and the political will to see the war through to its end, no matter the cost. Berlin did not fall to American infantry storming the Reichstag, but it fell because American forces, along with their British and Soviet allies, had strangled the Reich from every direction, severed its supply lines, shattered its armies, and made clear that no amount of willpower could overcome material reality. The German soldier had been told he fought for a superior civilization. In the end, he learned that civilization is measured not in ideology, but in the capacity to sustain and protect its people. And by that measure, his had failed utterly. The war in Europe ended not with a climactic duel, but with exhaustion and surrender. American soldiers stood in the rubble of German cities and felt not triumph, but a weary relief. They had done what was asked of them. They had crossed an ocean, fought through hedgerows and forests and rivers, and helped bring down a regime that had threatened to plunge the world into endless darkness. Berlin had fallen. The Third Reich was extinct, and somewhere in the ruins, a can of American peaches sat half-eaten, a small monument to the quiet power of abundance over fanaticism, of democracy's patience over tyranny's haste. The road to Berlin had been long. It had been paid for in blood and steel, and the grinding persistence of men who simply refused to stop. And when it was over, the lesson remained, carved into the rubble of Europe, that freedom, when harnessed to purpose and will, can outlast any creed built on hatred and conquest. The clash was over. The Titan had fallen, and the world, however broken, could begin again.